I was living in a hotel, and at one point there was a student protest, and I guess the police wanted to throw tear gas into the protest, but the tear gas canisters look a lot like grenades, and they got them mixed up. It was pretty nasty. The next step after that is to ferment the cocoa beans. Chocolate and cocoa, they're a fermented product. So cocoa beans are fermented for 4 to 6 days. It takes the cocoa beans from a white color to our chocolatey brown color that we associate with chocolate. And that fermentation step over 6 days in the country of origin, in this tropical country, often in really rural areas, that's what gives chocolate around 80% of its flavor.
Right. Mark, welcome to this humble little platform. Before you take us all on this sensual journey, I'm hoping it's going to be like a real rewarding and sensual journey about chocolate manufacture. How did you get into this? Because last time I saw you, you were a consultant in Africa or something.
Yeah, so it's good to be here, Danny. Thanks for having me. So how I got here to where I am right now with my own chocolate company called Wallace Craft Chocolate is I started in Africa. I was doing consulting work all across the continent of Africa, different countries from Zambia to DRC to Sierra Leone, and then finally ended up in Liberia, where just sort of randomly I ended up working in cocoa, in agricultural value chains in cocoa, really with the end goal of having farmers get a better price for their cocoa. Liberia is a post-conflict country. There was a lot of work to do rehabilitating farms and then working with farmers and traders and international companies in order to get them a better price for cocoa. You know, most cocoa farmers around the world, cocoa is farmed largely by smallholder farmers. So 90% of the cocoa is grown by people with just small plots of land who are often subsistence farmers and living on below a living wage almost exclusively.
What's that industry term? Like the ratio of the labor that they put in versus the yield of the field is like a very bad ratio. What's that called? Because when you're subsistence farming, they spend like their whole life basically working and get very little for it. Is that how it is for them?
Yeah, I think the term that's most commonly used is the living income differential. So that takes into account all of the costs that the smallholder farmers have, as well as the incomes that they have, and often that differential is lower than a living income for these farmers. So they're living below a living wage. It's calculated differently in different countries because there's different contexts. But in Liberia and West Africa, where most of the world's cocoa comes from, is West Africa, farmers are often living below a living wage. And that's for a variety of reasons. Really bad pricing from the big international cocoa buyers. And alongside that, there's a lot of environmental degradation, social issues that come with that, child labor, forced labor, and things like that. And so really the work that I was doing was about addressing all those problems, but really through a private sector lens and about increasing the income of cocoa farmers. And through that, we did a lot of work on cocoa quality. Cocoa farmers can produce higher quality cocoa. They can get a better price for their cocoa beans and a higher income. And I was there for the better part of 5 years in Liberia, and I ended up learning more about cocoa than I ever thought. So I ended up being somewhat of a cocoa expert. And I was there on a project. So the way that it works with development, it was funded through international development, is it goes on cycles. So it was a 5-year project cycle. And when that ended, I ended up back in Canada, but I wanted to stay connected with the cocoa farmers I was working with. And they had gotten to a point where they had cocoa of the quality necessary to make craft chocolate, to make bean to bar high-end chocolate. So now I'm actually able to purchase cocoa from the farmers I was working with, which was really important to me to maintain those connections. I pay them a good price for their cocoa beans, and I'm able to make some really good chocolate with the cocoa beans.
So there's no middleman. Do you still travel there to do this, or?
I traveled there once in a while. I haven't been there as much as I'd like, but there is no middleman between my Liberian cocoa suppliers. It's direct trade. So the industry term is direct trade. So we buy directly from the farmers.
All right. But in that case, you also take the supply chain risk. You can't blame anyone else. As you said, there are all these issues in West African cocoa production, like slavery, child labor, things like that. Now it's on you as the business owner to make sure that you're buying this from the right people who are doing it correctly, right?
Yeah, absolutely. All that risk is definitely on me. The ways that we mitigate it is that I know these farmers I know them quite well, and I've known them for a long time. I've done work with them on their farms in terms of those risks, such as child labor, forced labor, deforestation, agroforestry, use of chemicals, and I know that they don't do those things. We do a transparency audit. So we use a process called radical transparency where we disclose to our customers everything that's going on in the farms and also all the prices that we pay along the supply chain. So with Liberia, the supply chain is really short. It's just me and the farmers. But I disclose the prices that I'm paying for the cocoa beans as well. So consumers can see exactly what we're paying.
That's very cool. So did you go into this work already with this kind of ethical consciousness, or you arrived there just because it was a job you got after university and then you kind of noticed how messed up everything was in Africa and then you decided to do this, or a combination of both?
I think it was a combination of both. I mean, after my undergrad, I studied in the west coast of Canada. I'm in the west coast of Canada now. And I did my undergrad here and never really used it. But my first business that I started in 2008 was a construction business. 2008 ended up being maybe not the best time to start a construction business with the global recession just about to happen. But anyway, I did that business for about 5 years and it just wasn't really fulfilling something in me. I didn't really know what it was. It was profitable. It was a successful business, but I knew it wasn't something that I wanted to do. And I think, in hindsight, I think that was because it wasn't really living up to my values. At the time, I don't think I would have been able to tell you that, but I just knew that it wasn't something I wanted to pursue. And then very randomly afterwards, I ended up in Zambia in Africa working with an NGO. And I just really took that role because I had nothing else to do. Like I didn't know what I wanted to do. And it came up through a friend and I just ended up going. And I went there for a year. And that's sort of how my more values-based consulting work began. I did that for a year, realized I didn't have the technical skill or knowledge or foundational knowledge in business that I needed. So then I went to Cambridge for a year and I met you at Cambridge.
And that's when your ethical compass really started spinning.
Yeah, that's when my ethics were really tested, is when I met you.
You hit the true magnetic north or whatever it's called and the compass went crazy, yeah. So tell me, when you went to Africa as a consultant, but I'm assuming for a big multinational consultancy, but overall, not just your company and whoever you worked for and what you did, but Western consultancies out there, as a general rule, would you say that they're doing good work? Because some of them are getting paid pretty hefty money from either aid money from their own countries combined with local government natural resources money. Considering how much the salaries are or whatever you got paid, do you think you made a difference? And do you think other cowboys out there made a difference, gringos?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've got some strong opinions on that. The consultancy that I was working for, they weren't one of the big four, but they were pretty big in the international development space. So you don't see too many of the big consultancies in development, except for McKinsey, I think, went in for a little bit. But by and large, the development sector, the work that gets done is you don't see a lot of sustainable, good change, positive change. There's a lot of money. There's a lot of waste. There's a lot of virtue signaling and poverty tourism kind of things going on. For me personally, I was in that system, and you can get pretty cynical when you're in that system.
God damn it, you're confirming everything I thought. But there are some good people, right, who are not staying in the gated communities and writing things on a laptop, who are actually talking to locals and doing good work. Give us some hope.
There are some people. Unfortunately, there aren't many. And a lot of development programs, people stay in capital cities and they stay in their compounds. And, my place in Monrovia was in a gated compound. So I'm not immune to that. Monrovia is not necessarily the safest place in the world. That's the capital of Liberia. And Liberia is a very underdeveloped country and there's lots of crime. But yeah, I think that the best people are those that you have to take an individual stance on how you approach the work that you're doing in development. And the way that I like to frame it is like, you're not going to change the world. A lot of the people who have development degrees, I always joke, people with degrees in international development are the worst at doing international development because they're seeing it all as a project. They're seeing people as like a means to an end. some larger ideal. But for me, I just try to keep it realistic as much as I can and just do as much good work as you can. Like just try to do your little slice of good work. And I was really fortunate in this job because right away I got sent out into the cocoa belt of Liberia, which is, it's way out there. It takes a couple days along really bumpy, terrible roads that in the rainy season are pretty much impassable and get blocked by big trucks.
Mark, the roads are just different. They're not terrible. You're being Eurocentric.
Yeah, they're not paved anyway, and it takes forever. There's no, there's not refrigeration. There's not much electricity in a lot of places. So you're out there, through that. Since it takes so much time to get between places, I ended up spending a lot of time in really rural communities, and I was really able to have a really human-facing experience. Like I spent a lot of time with cocoa farmers and with the leaders of cooperatives who trade in cocoa, who are dealing with the challenges. The road is really bad, but that's actually a very serious issue for cocoa trade. If it takes a long time for cocoa beans to get from the really rural areas, say it takes 3 days to a week for them to get to the port during the rainy season, that can ruin a whole truckload of cocoa beans. And that's a really, really significant for farmers who are living on the poverty line. And that's a major source of income for their family. So you get a lot of experience with that. And also just sitting with people, eating food with people. I got malaria and typhoid more times than a human should probably have. But
which one's worse? I'm guessing typhoid's worse.
Danny, the worst is getting both at the same time. And I had that once. And it was pretty bad. It feels like all of your bones are snapping at the joints. You're shivering, it's sweating. It's pretty nasty.
So Liberia is like, that's where you learned about the cocoa trade, but when were you in the DRC? How did you end up there?
I was in the DRC before I was in Liberia. I was in the DRC on a project through the same consultancy I was working for, and it was another private sector development program. I was down in Lubumbashi mostly, and it was during an election time when that time was very rich in copper. The south of DRC in Lubumbashi, that's the capital of the south there, and they were the opposition. So very rich in minerals, but also the opposition. So there was a lot of political turmoil there and a lot of violent suppression. I was living in a hotel, and at one point there was a student protest, and I guess the police wanted to throw tear gas into the protest, but the tear gas canisters look a lot like grenades, and they got them mixed up. And it was pretty nasty.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Jesus. So this was official DRC government troops though, right? If they can get tear gas and normal grenades mixed up, then imagine what are those number gangs they have, M23 or M21 or whatever they're called. I'm guessing their methods are just brutal to begin with.
Yeah, they're more active in the east of the DRC, in the areas where there's different minerals and gemstones and things like that. That's kind of why they're there. And yeah, I think that they're pretty brutal.
So where was the closest sort of close call where you thought you might be seriously hurt or kidnapped or something like that?
Well, there's a couple stories there. That brings us back to development and how some people just get it totally wrong. So I was in Liberia at the time, and I worked with a lot of farming communities, a lot of farmers. So we ended up working with about 22,000 farming households in all sorts of communities across the cocoa belt in Liberia. And in doing that work, you end up with having databases of farmers. You have lists of farmers internally that we use to keep track of income change and where farmers are and things like that. Another development organization, their method was just to give cash directly to farmers. That was how they thought development should be done. Just give cash and let people sort it out. And somehow one of my managers or some director gave my list of cocoa farmers to this Give Directly group against my strong advice. And they gave a bunch of cash to some farmers in these communities, the farmers that were on my list. This was a list of people who had received a specific training. So they ended up dispersing cash to some farmers, but not all. And, good intentions, but a real lack of understanding of the context. You can't just go into a community that you know nothing about and give cash to some people and not others. There's also considerations like there's a chief system, there's a government system, and there are people that need to be informed. It's a complex society in ways that a lot of Westerners don't understand. So this caused a huge conflict. Since it was my list, the farmers thought that the money was being given by me, and some people were excluded. So uh, the next time I visited that community, I actually got like I almost got lynched by a mob. I got surrounded by a mob of armed people, very angry people. And if it weren't for my relationships there that I'd built over the years, the chief actually came in and sort of rescued me before this mob of really angry people who had kind of swarmed my car and pulled me out of it. If he hadn't come in and intervened, I don't know what would have happened. That was the closest call. And funnily enough, it was caused by a development organization, not by anything else like armed militias or something like that. It was actually because of development. But that was probably the closest. Another time I got a couple guys kidnapped accidentally. I was working in DRC in the capital city of Kinshasa. I was staying in the company housing, and it was about a block away from the office. And I would just walk through this alleyway to the office every morning. And we had some consultants come visit us from another country, and they asked how to get to the office. Should they take a car? And I was like, oh, it's just a block away. Just walk. And I walked to work. I was always fine. But in that block, when they walked to the office, they ended up getting held up at gunpoint and thrown in the back of a car and taken around to all sorts of ATMs to get all their money stolen from them. And they eventually got returned. They were pretty shaken up, and that was kind of my fault. Yeah.
So when these happen, like these kind of incidents, so the risk is right that the next time your employers send you out with some kind of South African mercenary security, or nowadays I guess Russian, and then you suddenly, when you arrive in the village, now you have armed men with you, and then the whole dynamic changes. Is that a problem? Because yeah, I would say if I was working there, I would ask for a gun for myself or someone else who has one.
Yeah, I was
Right?
pretty lucky. I never had to have armed security with me. Even after that time where I almost got lynched, I didn't feel like having an armed security would have been even that helpful. Like, yeah, I think that it would add an authoritarian dynamic that I wasn't really I didn't want to come across as an authoritarian or somebody who is above or different from the communities. I think you get a lot more when you try to integrate, when you try to just meet people as people. And if you show up with armed guards, that's going to definitely shift that dynamic. That being said, when I was in Nigeria doing a little bit of scoping work for cocoa, we did have to have armed guards with us. We had to have land cruisers with guys with AK-47s in front of us and behind us. And I think in that context, people were just used to that. Everyone was armed. So it probably just depends on your context. Like, you're not going to go out. I also do work in minerals as well in the Sahel. Right, but I never went out to the mines, but you have to have armed security when you're working in the Sahel in minerals.
Sahel is like the sub-Saharan bit
Yeah, right below
of Africa.
Sahara.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, I never knew it was so exciting for you out there. Maybe I should get into this work. It's tickling my excitement bone.
Yeah, if you have a desire to pick up a couple tropical diseases, a bit of malaria,
So
some typhoid.
so when you had malaria a few times and then once combined the two of them, I'm assuming there's some Western medicine available for the gringos working in development that isn't necessarily available for the locals. But what can they even do about malaria or typhoid? You just have to fight it out. Is that how it works? Or are there modern meds now that work better?
There are meds, and it depends where you are. If you're in a capital city, you have access to private hospitals that are pretty hit or miss. None are great, especially in poor countries such as Liberia. But for typhoid, they give you antibiotics. For malaria, you can take a treatment. I don't even know what the treatment is, but malaria isn't a bacteria, it's a parasitic plasmodium, and the treatment is really nasty. If you have malaria and you take the treatment, you're really sick. A lot of the treatments for tropical diseases, if you have the disease, then the treatment is really bad. It's almost as bad as the disease. So if you pick up worms, almost everyone gets worms at one point or another working over there. But the dewormer, if you have worms, makes you so sick. And yeah, malaria, pretty bad. I mean, it's not so bad when you're in a capital city and you're able to stay in a room with a bed and it's probably going to be air conditioned if you're at home. But if you're out in the field and you're days away from reliable electricity, refrigeration, and things like that, then it can be pretty rough. I had a few experiences out in the field. The first time I got typhoid, I was out in the field, and it was pretty early on my time in Liberia, so I was pretty energetic, and my organization left me out there. They took the car away, so I was just getting from place to place on the back of a motorbike, going from cocoa cooperative to cocoa cooperative and eating food with people. Nothing's refrigerated. There's flies everywhere. Meat's just kind of left hanging out. And the meat that you eat is bush meat. And it's best not to ask what that is. It could be anything. There's something called a bush deer, which is like a small deer, but there's also monkeys around and things like that. But whenever I asked what type of meat it was, the response I would get was meat. It's just meat. Like, don't ask. Don't ask.
Is bush deer a dik-dik?
I don't know.
Dik-dik is a small, other than a very funny word to say. I think that's a small antelope in the.
It could be a dik-dik. I don't know. You just wanted to say dik-dik.
Yeah, I guess the safe thing is to say that you're vegetarian and then you don't have to eat that stuff.
Yeah, it's tough to get protein though. Otherwise, you'd just be eating rice and palm oil. The food's really hard to come by in those places, even, for anyone. So you're gonna eat the bush meat if it's there, if that's all you can eat. After a while, after years, I ended up bringing my own kind of canned tuna into the field. So I'd eat tuna on bread or something like that for long periods of time. But at first I was eating what everyone else was eating and just not being used to that food. I got sick a lot. The first time I got typhoid, I was out in the middle of the field. I was a couple days drive away from the capital city where you could get proper medicine, and I didn't have a car to even get there. And I got really sick. I was pretty tummy sick.
Do a lot of whiteys get really sick there all the time? Do people die doing this because they go in with no medicine with them and they go stray too far and then they get sick? Are there a lot of deaths?
I don't know if there's a lot of deaths. Everyone gets sick. Most people don't stray too far from the capital cities, though. A lot of people do work in the field, but I'd say most people just stay near to the capital cities, so you don't get quite as sick. And a lot of people will be in the capital city and not eating a lot of local food. They'll still be eating, sushi or whatever, burgers and stuff like that for their meals out.
Yeah. No more sushi though, because the Chinese have bought all the fish of Africa and fished them out. So no more.
Yeah, that's a whole other story. That's a huge issue around West Africa too. The illegal Chinese fishing boats.
Yeah, and I think those are very big issues to try to tackle in one conversation. So just to go back, you said you had some opinions about the actions of certain development workers. Was there anything particularly bad that you saw some whiteys working for someone else do there? Like anything particularly useless or just unethical?
I would say that it's not just whiteys. It's development organizations themselves. And I've seen a lot that's pretty bad. I think the biggest issue that I see is a lack of understanding of context in actually doing the work. So a lot of work gets done without an understanding of the context of what's going on in a place. But taking a step back and looking at the industry as a whole, the biggest issue is that it has become its own industry. It's about development organizations, fundraising, trying to get projects. It's more about having money for the sake of running the organizations rather than doing the development work itself. Staff, like overhead costs are huge. Paying high paid consultants, staffing, and then the actual deliverables of the project. There's always going to be projects that you need to do things, but that ends up being more of a checkbox exercise, making sure that you do it just good enough that you get your funding. And I'm not saying that it's like that everywhere, but you do see that quite pervasively.
So the fundraising operation and the government lobbying operation becomes bloated and all of it just to keep the lights on rather than actually making a difference.
And keeping the lights on is important. I think that a lot of the development organizations that I see that are successful, they do have a vision, they do have strong values, and those, you end up attracting funding that way too. You end up staying alive. But there's a lot that, there's a lot of people, there's a lot of organizations that, unfortunately are just trying to get money to keep the lights on, which you need to do. I get that, but not at the expense of the work that you're trying to do.
Yeah. But before we get into the actual chocolate production, which is, I guess, the X-rated part of this chat, at least for fatzos like me, what you said about lack of understanding of the context and like the village culture and all the social dynamics and the hierarchies in it, that I I can see it's not just development in Africa. I think that's a global problem everywhere. Like you take, for example, I don't know, let's take a village in Iraq. In the media or even in academia, when you write an essay or you write an argument, you're going to have to simplify things. So you talk about phenomena like radical Islam, Sunni Shia divide, things like that. And then you have to frame everything in these simplifications. But in reality, when you visit the village, all of this stuff lives together. Like they might say that, yeah, we're Iraqi nationalists and we want the government to work. But then also we're loyal to our family or our clan. And then we're also loyal to our ethno-religious group, like let's say Sunni Islam or whatever. And it all gets like really convoluted, right? And then you try to throw money at a problem like, oh, we're going to defeat radical Islam in this territory. But you're ignoring the fact that all these people's loyalties change based on what the question is. Yes, they agree with you when you explain about an independent democratic Iraq. They're like, yeah, I want better roads and I want jobs and I want to vote. But then they ask them, well, will you give up on these other loyalties to your family and your religion? And they say never, because those have been there for thousands of years. You see what I mean here? Like it's like the same problem outside of Africa, but it's all very complex once you actually set foot in a village.
I totally agree, and I think you're missing so much of the richness of the situation if you just distill it down to a few issues. There's a few things there. I mean, academia, I share the same kind of thoughts and frustrations with a lot of the academic work that happens, but you do understand that if you're doing in-depth academic work, you're distilling things down to a few sets of variables. And just by the nature of doing that, you're eliminating the complexity of these situations. I mean, and it's all intertwined. It's really difficult. And the only way to really see it is to go there. That's the best way, I think. You know, you'll understand it a lot better if you go there and you start talking to people. We think of things in terms of issues like you're talking about, and talk to people, and you'll still probably find that everyone's main priority is their family and loving their kids and things like that. And you'll find out a lot of different things that are most important to people, or the biggest challenges or pain points are going to be things that maybe you never even thought of. For instance, in Africa, if you're thinking about a farmer's wage being their cocoa production, you might not understand how the family dynamics work in terms of income generation. You know, these farms will grow other crops and they have a family over here and over here that's providing money, doing all these other things. So if you're thinking about like income in that context, you're not going to understand it unless you actually go and talk to people. And it's different in different communities. Like even our Iraq is not homogenous, right? There's going to be so much difference depending on where you are.
Yeah. I think in general, this thing about the developing world versus what we would call the developed world is that where we are. You're in Canada. I'm in the ether, pirate radio. I'm somewhere in the ocean. So where we are, the main institutions that control people's lives or that define people's lives nowadays with the nation state and the modern financial system are the state and money. And when you visit anywhere that's slightly more developing, you will quickly notice that the things that we have shed for those to become the controlling institutions of our lives, we shed religion and family. And those two are very much still the main things that people, I guess, build their lives around in a lot of places around the world.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the nation state and secularism and yeah, I don't know about the dollar money. I guess that is kind of like the religion of money right now. I think a lot of places are still operating in levels that are below, not below, but different than the nation state. In a lot of areas, there's still tribalism or kind of like chiefdom hierarchical structures that are most prevalent. And when colonialism happens, or when Western globalism happens and those are disrupted, it causes a lot of issues. These are often systems that worked pretty well. And that's another issue with development. If you're trying to foist development with an underlying set of ideals that goes against what is there on the ground, then it's going to be disruptive. There's going to be more negative externalities than positives from the work you're doing.
Yeah. So to get into chocolate now, you have found a source for beans now. And obviously, number one question is, you're in Liberia sourcing these beans. How much longer can you do this? Because the figures I've seen for the deforestation is wild. Like it's almost all gone. Or would you agree with that? Because I trust your experience more than some kind of United Nations figures, but those look bad. How much of the forest is left out there, and how long can you keep sourcing beans from there?
I would trust your sources, or at least in a general sense. The deforestation has been brutal in West Africa, largely in Ivory Coast and Ghana. Those are the world's largest cocoa supplying countries.
80% gone in Ghana, 94% in the Ivory Coast.
Yeah, and that's largely because of cocoa farming.
And for all of us wildlife perverts, that's where the elephants lived, with a D at the end. I think the elephants will be gone too, right?
Yeah, there's not so many elephants in West Africa. But yes, for cocoa comes from originally from South America, and it was brought to West Africa and planted there successfully. But the way that cocoa grows is it's a shade crop. It grows really well in a shaded rainforest. So it needs about 50% sun, 50% shade, and it grows really well with shade trees. So you can grow it in a rainforest, an existing rainforest. But then a higher yield variety of cocoa was developed where it is sun tolerant. So it can tolerate the sun and produce a lot more cocoa pods. And this hybrid variety was planted all throughout Ivory Coast and Ghana. And so since it can tolerate the sun, the rainforest was cleared. And that's why Ivory Coast.
Who developed that variety? Let me guess. Does it start with Monsanto and end with Toe?
I wouldn't be surprised. I think that people are talking about this global cocoa shortage due to climate change, and certainly there are climate change factors, but there's also been this monocrop agriculture, this one hybrid variety that's been planted throughout the largest cocoa growing regions, cut down all the rainforest, deplete the soil, use chemical fertilizers to try to enrich the soil, but there's no biodiversity and agroforestry to replenish that soil. Of course, we're going to have decreased cocoa stocks. But yeah, that's been pretty terrible in Ghana and Ivory Coast from a rainforest perspective. Like the deforestation is brutal. And even in the countries where there's still lots of rainforest, there's a lot of illegal deforestation happening now. So you'll be out in the jungle and you'll see trucks with big, huge jungle trees, like one tree trunk per large truck. These trees are enormous. And it's really sad. It's terrible. But, countries like Sierra Leone and Liberia, where I was, they were a little bit protected from deforestation because they had brutal civil wars. So it was good for deforestation. Obviously, the civil wars were horrible, but it has left these countries with more pristine rainforest. So there's lots of efforts now to have agriculture within the rainforest, which is agroforestry. So protecting the rainforest while actually growing your cocoa crops within the rainforest. And that's something that consumers of chocolate are valuing. So consumers are looking for rainforest-friendly cocoa, and there's certifications and things like that, which I don't really love, but they can assure consumers that they're getting cocoa from areas that are protected.
Those listening who aren't as gluttonous and just jonesing for their fat and sugar fix like I am and mindlessly purchasing the cheapest chocolate. For those who care and are trying to do the right thing, these Western certifications that you see, fair trade or environmental certifications, how much can you trust those, or is it all bullshit?
Well, you used to be able to trust them a lot more than you can now. I think now consumers have to be a bit more careful. So like anything, they started out as being quite robust and quite idealistic. And then once people were demanding them more and more, they got kind of bought up by bigger companies, or bigger companies were able to pay their way into getting these certifications. And the certifications themselves, they say good things. They talk about using chemical fertilizers. They talk about deforestation. They talk about fair wages. In practice, it's really difficult to verify this. A lot of the companies that are doing audits on these certifications are from other West African countries, other companies where corruption is sort of the norm. So you can pass your certification audit with not too much money, as opposed to doing the actual hard work, which can sometimes be quite costly. And that's why I don't love certifications. I think there is a place for them. I think that by and large, it's probably better buying certified organic chocolate if that's what you really want. It'll give you some assurance. What I do, I prefer what I do, which is transparency and just disclose everything we're doing.
You just tell the story, and your story is believable enough. Therefore, you don't need someone else's a sticker on it. How much do those stickers cost though? Like how much would it cost you per bar or per kilo to get that certification? Because I'm sure they charge.
Yeah, it's a lot. I don't know. I don't have the value per bar or per kilo, but for small chocolate makers, it's often prohibitively expensive to certify their factory. So there's a few levels of certification, the beans, but then you also have to certify your factory or your workshop or wherever you're making your chocolate. It's prohibitively expensive for small makers to certify themselves. At the other side of it, we talked about how cocoa is grown by smallholder farmers, often in poor countries, in tropical countries around the world. Small farmers also can't afford to certify their cocoa beans. Only the big companies now can afford to certify things. So it excludes a lot of smaller producers, which again is an issue with the system, with the certification system.
Of course. So now beans, they get harvested, and then you said there may be massive issues with bad roads and infrastructure and getting them fresh to you, but they arrive to a port somewhere, I'm assuming, and let's say they get onto the boat, okay, and the boat arrives in, where does it arrive? The East Coast, and then it's trucked over to you on the West Coast, or how does that work?
Yeah, so my chocolate company, we source cocoa beans from 5 different origins around the world, not just West Africa. So I source cocoa beans from Guatemala, Dominican Republic, Bolivia, and the Philippines. And they do arrive in a port and then they're trucked to us.
So when they arrive, you get, I'm assuming, just a mishmash of stuff packaged out there. Do you take a big scoop and then you chop it up and you taste it raw? Are you the main instant quality control, or do you have some kind of tasting professional who chops it up and tastes whether they're fresh, or how does it work?
No, I'm the main tasting professional. So I've done even through my work in West Africa and then beyond, I have the qualifications and credential and experience now to be able to do that analysis. But I think that this is a larger conversation about cocoa quality in general. And it really starts in the country of origin. So in the country of origin, like somewhere like in West Africa, in Liberia, cocoa trees are harvested and cocoa grows as a fruit on a tree. It grows in a pod, which is a big fleshy pod, and it's harvested with a machete when the pods are ripe. And the first step after that is breaking the pods apart, and inside the pod are cocoa beans, about 40 to 60 cocoa beans per pod. And they're scooped out, and when they're scooped out, they're covered with a really fruity, fleshy, kind of gooey mucus sort of on it. And it's really sweet. If you taste it, it kind of tastes like a really sweet honeydew melon. And the next step after that is to ferment the cocoa beans. Chocolate and cocoa, they're a fermented product. So cocoa beans are fermented for 4 to 6 days. It takes the cocoa beans from a white color to our chocolatey brown color that we associate with chocolate. And that fermentation step over 6 days in the country of origin, in this tropical country, often in really rural areas, that's what gives chocolate around 80% of its flavor. So quality control and quality really has to be done in country of origin. And that's why I have really close relationships with the farmers that I work with. We're talking about fermentation all the time. After cocoa beans are fermented, they're then dried in the sun. Sun drying is the best. Big companies use mechanical dryers using diesel engines blowing hot air through cocoa beans. That's not good for fine chocolate. That can ruin the flavor of chocolate if you dry cocoa beans too quickly, or you can get things like diesel fumes or smoke absorbed into your cocoa beans, which again is not good for cocoa flavor, like you can imagine.
That, I bet that shit is what that government chocolate they give to soldiers. That, I bet that's that diesel chocolate.
That's any bulk chocolate. That's like Cadbury's or Hershey's and stuff like that, that they'll buy a lot of poor quality chocolate, not necessarily contaminated with chemicals, but pretty bad quality chocolate. And the first steps when cocoa beans come to me after they've been dried and bagged in the country of origin is we roast the cocoa beans and then we remove the shell and we refine the cocoa beans for days, for 3 days in a big stone grinder with granite wheels. And that folds air into chocolate and evaporates out all the unwanted chemicals. Just like when you're decanting wine, you're pouring air through the wine to enrich the flavor of the wine and remove any volatiles that you don't want. We do that over 3 days with big stone wheels and a drum, folding the chocolate over and over again. But the bigger companies, they don't They don't do that process. They want to homogenize cocoa beans. They want all their chocolate to taste the same, so they just roast the hell out of their bad beans to hide the flaws. And then they dump in things like refined sugars, soy,
Mm.
fillers, emulsifiers, sometimes palm oil or different oils.
And in
Uh,
America, what's that? High fructose corn syrup. They throw some of that in just for shits and giggles.
if it doesn't have high fructose corn syrup in it in America, it's not really food.
No, yeah, exactly. But then again, I know you make amazing craft chocolate, but have you ever had a peanut butter M&M?
You know, there's something to be said about peanut butter M&Ms.
I know, but
Yeah,
if you have more than like 16 of them, the skin of your mouth starts to like fall off from the chemicals. They're illegal here in Europe. I always get them shipped from America. So they're
contraband M&Ms. No, they're good. They're tasty, right? They're a they're a guilty pleasure snack or something like that. You're eating them because they're delicious. The chocolate in them though is that's the bad quality chocolate. That is just homogenized chocolate, industrially produced, probably sourced from areas where they're not really paying that much attention to environmental and social issues. There's, child labor issues or huge exploitation issues. Environmental deforestation is likely coming from those areas when you're eating your peanut M&Ms. Not to say you should always feel guilty when eating them, but if you're looking for more of an experience,
you're not
especially
gonna
from a
feel
flavor
great either.
perspective, you're not going to feel great. Like you said, your mouth hurts after a dozen of them.
Yeah. Yeah. So, you said that it's a massive machine and it's 3 days before you even get to the where we're gonna get to in a moment, the sexy, gooey, flowy, melty parts of chocolate manufacture. Before then, you have massive machines running for 3 days. All of this sounds like a massive capital investment. Is it a huge threshold of entry into the chocolate business? Do you need a lot of money to start even thinking about this?
Yeah, depending on the scale of your business, there's definitely capital investment. The machines making chocolate requires machines. It requires machineries. You need a roaster to be able to roast your cocoa beans. You need the refiner, or several refiners, depending on how you're going to be doing it. We use stone wheels, granite stone wheels, because that makes the best flavor and the best mouth feel, the feeling in your mouth when you're actually tasting the chocolate, how it melts on your tongue. And then you need a tempering machine as well. So a way to make it so that that chocolate, when it flows into the molds, it then sets, so that it has a snap and doesn't just melt in your hands. That's called tempering chocolate. You have to temper chocolate just like they temper steel or temper glass. Chocolate is also tempered. And you need a machine that can do that as well. So yeah, there is a capital investment. Um, and depending on the size you are, it can be, it can be quite significant. It is, we at the end of the day, it is manufacturing, right? It's food manufacturing.
Yeah. Okay. How many years are you into this now? Like 10
We're
years?
3 years old.
3 years old. Okay.
Yeah, we're a pretty young
So,
company.
yeah, but you found a customer base in British Columbia.
Yeah, in British Columbia in Western Canada. So that's where we sell most of our chocolate. We have a few other accounts a bit further abroad in Canada and in the States mostly.
Well, you have prices in pounds, in British pounds on your website. Would you ship some out here to those listeners who are unfortunate enough to be British?
Yeah, we'll ship it out to the UK for sure. We will ship internationally. We have shipped to the UK before and other places in Europe. Since we're small and we're on the west coast of Canada, most people in the UK don't know about us.
Yeah. But they should, because you're the real deal. I mean, just the amount of times you had malaria, that should sell it. Like that means that means you've
Yeah,
done the legwork, right?
I should advertise that on a
Yeah,
bit
you
more.
should put it on the website. Like our CEO has had malaria 17 times. So a silly question before we get to the next stage. The final product of, I don't know if it's a Western process of where it was invented, the refined chocolate product at the end. Do African farmers, I'm sure you take some to them when you go, but do they generally enjoy it? Or is it like at all part of the culture to eat Western style chocolates? And if so, what do they like? Milk, dark, white? What do they think is the best?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think it's a silly question at all, really. And the short answer is many cocoa farmers in places where I've worked, they don't really know what a chocolate bar is. The temperatures in these areas are higher than the melting point of chocolate bars, unless it's a really processed chocolate bar that has a bunch of added waxes and things like that to raise its melting temperature. But chocolate melts at about 27 degrees. So if you're higher than that, it's going to melt. So most farmers' experience with chocolate is in drinking chocolate, like hot chocolate powders or something like that, or some cookies with some chocolate chips or something, like baked goods with cocoa powder in it, if that even. So chocolate bars aren't really well known. And I think that for that reason, there isn't much of a domestic chocolate market in any of the countries where cocoa is produced. So you don't see a lot of chocolate factories making chocolate bars for domestic consumption. It's almost all farmed in tropical countries, often poor countries, but consumed in the West, in richer countries. I do bring chocolate bars to cocoa farmers that I work with, and the reaction is always positive. I think it's more like interesting than this is delicious chocolate. It's kind of like a new experience rather than comparing it to other chocolates or things like that. And the taste preference is more on a sweeter, milkier bar for sure. That's preferred more.
Well, I think, yeah. I mean, dark chocolate's an acquired taste. Milk chocolate's always the entry level, isn't it? So
true. Yeah.
But speaking of, now we've done your machine that does what it does, and then the beans come out. By the way, before this, you've already chopped some up and tasted that they're worth going through the process with, that they're the real deal.
Yeah, whenever we get a shipment of cocoa beans in, we do a test on the batch, and that involves taking several hundred cocoa beans, doing an analysis, seeing if there's foreign matter and things like that, and then doing something called a cut test where you take 300 beans and you chop them in half and you look for things like if the fermentation was done properly. You can see that on the inside of the cocoa bean. If there wasn't fermentation, if there are any pests like insect damage, there's something called the cocoa moth, which can infest cocoa beans. And it can ruin whole batches of cocoa beans during shipment and beforehand. And we also look for things like internal mold. So if there's mold on the inside of the beans, it means that the beans were shipped when they were not dried enough, or they were stored when they weren't dried enough. So we look for all these things, and then also we taste the cocoa. We're always tasting throughout. The risk of tasting cocoa beans when they first come to you is you can have parasites and things like that. So before cocoa beans are roasted, they haven't been sterilized yet. So I taste cocoa beans all the time that haven't been roasted, but we can't give them to people. Oftentimes in the country of origin, cocoa beans are left out to dry on a table. Cocoa farmers also have chickens and other things around, and they're hopping around the cocoa beans. So there's a salmonella risk. And other things. Yeah, so when we roast the cocoa beans, we make sure we roast it to the proper temperature for the correct length of time where it kills all the parasites, and we do testing and things like that. But then after it gets roasted and you remove the shell, you grind up the cocoa beans. The first step is they turn into cocoa nibs, which is kind of a crushed up cocoa bean, and we're tasting those for sure, making sure our roast is done, but also making sure the quality of the bean itself is good. And we're always tasting throughout as well. As soon as we put them in our refiner, we're tasting all the time. And it's not formulaic. When you put the cocoa nibs into our grinder, I said it grinds for 3 days with huge granite stones, crushing the beans, mixing the beans for around 3 days. We don't say it's 72 hours exactly, and then it's done. There's art and there's kind of an alchemy to chocolate making as well. It's more artisanal than like a factory-based, really prescriptive process. So it's done when it's done, and if it's not done, you might have to leave it in for longer. You might have to have a shorter things. There's other factors like ambient temperature and humidity that affect things. Every batch of cocoa beans is different because it is a plant, and we're not homogenizing. We're not trying to make everything taste the same. If one year's harvest tastes different than another year's harvest, that's an interesting aspect. It's the same as with wine, right?
And when you mess up, you still sell it, but you call it a characterful flavor.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's It's more artisanal that way.
Yeah. It's earthy. Like if it goes wrong, it's an earthy chocolate. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So now we have the nibs. Do we then have to introduce some kind of butter to make them into a goo? And what butter is that?
You do not. Many chocolate makers do. They'll use oils or cocoa butter. They'll add cocoa butter. But the cocoa bean itself it's a seed. The cocoa bean is a seed, and a seed needs an energy source to grow, and that energy source is fat. So half of a cocoa bean itself is fat. And if you were to separate that fat from the cocoa bean, that would be cocoa butter. So half of the cocoa bean is fat, which if you separate it, you need a machine to do this. It would be cocoa butter, and the other half is what it becomes cocoa powder.
Yeah.
That's used in baking and things like that. But we use the entire cocoa bean. So as we crush the cocoa bean in our machines, it liquefies itself. Half it heats up, and that cocoa butter inside the seed melts, and it liquefies, and that provides the gooey liquidity of the cocoa bean. It's all just from the cocoa bean itself. And our dark chocolate has two ingredients. It's just cocoa beans and organic cane sugar. And we use the organic cane sugar because it has the least flavor. It complements cocoa the most. It doesn't mask the flavor or alter the flavor of the actual cocoa beans themselves.
Well, now that we're in liquid form, this is like when the experience gets sensual. Do you ever like, because you know, in Wagyu beef and stuff, they play classical music to the cows and give them beer and stuff. Does the chocolate get better if you have the right music while it's flowing out? You know, put
Oh
some
man,
Mozart on or something.
it probably does. I don't know. I've never experienced. I've never gone to those depths. I've never played classical music to my cocoa beans.
Ah, well, there's something you could try. Yeah.
Yeah, that and to advertise, right? That's something that I'm sure there's a market that would just love that. This is that your chocolate bar has been infused with Mozart during the production
Infused with
process.
Mozart, yeah, and I bet you don't have to pay copyright for someone who's dead and buried so long, you know?
Perfect.
So,
No cost.
yeah, exactly. Cheap and cheerful. So the goo is not the final thing yet, right? Now we've liquefied the beans and they flow into some kind of massive vat. You're saying you're tasting along the process, so you're tasting some of this. I want that job, whatever. We'll talk about that later. But then that goo still has to be tempered to become the final goo, no?
Yeah. So as it's being refined, it's liquidy, it's getting smoother. So it starts out being quite coarse and grainy, and then after about 48 hours, the particle size is down to it's smooth on your tongue. It'll feel smooth on your tongue, and we measure that. We measure the particle size of our chocolate. And a stone grinder actually makes that chocolate even smoother than like the industrial companies use a ball mill where they use steel balls and it makes it kind of taste buttery. But if you ever see stone ground chocolate, it's going to taste smooth and kind of cool on your tongue. So we do that. And then after 3 days of being stirred in our refiner, having air folded in, which allows the volatile compounds to evaporate out of the chocolate, leaving only the really flavorful compounds in the chocolate. It's a nice goo liquid chocolate. It smells amazing. The factory smells so good. And we pour it into our tempering machine. So we have a big mass of melted chocolate that is then stirred in our tempering machine. And the tempering machine pumps the chocolate through it into our molds. So to temper the chocolate, it has to lower the temperature of the chocolate and then raise the temperature of the chocolate again. And that allows the fat content of the chocolate to crystallize in such a way that it won't melt in your hands and will actually snap when you break a piece of chocolate apart. And then we pour it into our molds, and then it sets, it cools, and then we have our chocolate bar.
Yeah. So when people have this tempering process in a recipe or something, it's so difficult to do on your stove and stuff. Is that because the chocolate they're using is generally crap? So if you make a tiniest error in trying to temper chocolate for like a dessert recipe, it's because everything separates wrong because it's not the real deal.
Yeah, it could be. It's also just really hard to do on a stovetop. You're using a small amount of chocolate. When you see it in a really artisanal shop, like a confectionery shop, they use a marble slab. And that's because when you heat the chocolate up, you pour it on the slab and the slab cools it really quickly. And then they put it back in the bowl and that raises the temperature again. That tempers the chocolate. That's why they're using a marble slab. It's a cool slab that maintains a cold temperature. It's just a really tricky process to do. And since we're doing a larger volume of chocolate bars, we need a machine to do that. We can't do it all in a marble slab. It would be impossible for us to do it that way. It's just really hard. And yeah, it's a lot harder if you have low quality chocolate with bad ingredients. If you have different oils, especially added to, like you said, palm oil added to the chocolate, it melts at a different temperature, it hardens at a different temperature. It can make it a lot trickier.
Yeah. And how many times when you got started did this all go massively wrong before you got a great batch?
Like so many times. There's always issues where things go massively wrong. Before I was able to get started, yeah, it's a huge learning process. I was lucky to be able to work with some people in West Africa that were part of some really fine chocolate makers in Europe. I was able to sort of just randomly get connected with them, and then some other people were able to help me through a lot of the initial parts of being a craft chocolate maker, and also got some education in it. But there's a lot of learning by doing, and especially in developing, your final recipe for a chocolate bar, there's a lot of testing, different recipes, different types, but a lot can go wrong. It's with machines and things like that, but also there's so many factors. When you think of a cocoa bean coming from a cocoa pod in West Africa and all the steps along the way from harvesting to breaking the pods, fermentation, drying, storage, bagging, shipping, then when we get it, unloading, roasting, cracking the beans, removing the shell, and then grinding and refining, tempering, molding, cooling, all these steps, something can go wrong. If anything goes wrong at any of those steps, it can wreck the quality. It can wreck your chocolate bar. So yeah, there's definitely, and things do go wrong. They definitely go wrong.
Business-wise, you can still sell that somewhere, though. A bad batch for you guys, can you recover some cost by selling it to a big manufacturer for stock chocolate or whatever? Or is it just wasted?
Thankfully, we haven't had to do anything like that yet. We haven't had any like really bad shipments come through. It definitely can happen. And I've seen it with other companies where a bad batch has had to be shipped to a factory at a discount that turns it into cosmetics or something like that. But we haven't had to do that yet. We've had batches of chocolate, accidentally pour out of one of our refiners, and then that's just wasted. You can't do anything with that if it ends up on the floor. So we've had that kind of issue, but we haven't had huge issues with a whole batch of beans. Sometimes you just can't sell it though. If something goes wrong and it's contaminated with something, then that's a wasted batch.
Yeah. Now we have the lovely tempered chocolate is settling in these molds, and you have like a turtle shaped thing for kids, and then you maybe have a naughty shaped thing for bachelorette parties or whatever. And now you take them, where do you take them? Because I'm assuming big supermarkets are not interested in actual food. They want to sell cheap shit to people. So where do we find a gap for this stuff?
Yeah, big supermarkets are not that interested in my chocolate or people like me who make craft chocolate. They are more into the bulk stuff. The price is lower. Yeah, they're just not interested. They need higher volumes than kind of what we make right now. So the market for my chocolate bars, bean to bar, your craft chocolate shops, so bespoke chocolate shops or specialty grocery stores, or cafes and specialty butchers. Often around here, butcher shops have kind of specialty products. So places that sell kind of higher end specialty products, they're a good fit for Wallace Craft chocolate bars, for my chocolate bars.
Yeah. Do you have garden centers in Canada? Because here in the UK, where the middle class buys a lot of expensive stuff or more premium stuff, is they go for a day to a garden center that has something for the kids to do and something for the dog to do. And, someone can buy their golf equipment there and another person can buy craft chocolate. Do you have those kind of things in Canada?
Oh man, I remember going to garden centers in the UK and I was like, what is this? It's like
it's awesome
theme park almost. We don't have them yeah, we don't have garden centers to that extent here. It's not as much of a thing. But there are some garden places that have carriage or chocolate bars that do a bit more of that, but it's not to the same extent as in the UK.
Nah, because your product would fit so perfectly. We have this place near us that's like a posh garden center, and it has train rides for kids, and then inside there's like sailing and golf clothing for men, and I don't know, like fancy home and cookware. Great place, just
That's
paradise,
perfect.
man.
Maybe one day you'll see my chocolate bars there. Maybe one day.
Okay, so when we arrive at this, like I'm assuming you do little promotional stalls at, I don't know, chocolate fairs or whatever, and then Martha from Vancouver Island comes up and tastes it and then doesn't buy it or makes a face or something. Then how do you feel? Do you get real angry like, Jesus, do you understand that I've been out there crawling with malaria and typhoid and stuff and I'm trying to do a real thing here? So if you're not happy, just go buy fucking Hershey's, which by the way is the most disgusting thing ever created. Oh my God, that stuff. That's not chocolate. That's a crime against not only Africa but all of humanity. But still, like, do you get pissed off if people don't like it?
Yeah, totally. I mean, you don't get pissed off really, but it's like any work, right? You have all sorts of different emotions all the time. It depends how patient I'm feeling. There aren't that many people who taste it and don't like it, but there are, if you're selling chocolate and you're offering samples, there can be a lot of people who just take chocolate and jam it in their face and just kind of walk off. You just have to get used to it. There's all kinds of people, and not everyone's going to be of the demographic that we really appeal to, I guess. And yeah, I mean, you try to. It depends. You're working pretty hard and sell chocolate. After a few of it, you're kind of tired, and when people are not the best, sometimes it can make you pissed off. But it's all part of it.
Yeah. Man, first of all, thank you for your time. This has been incredible and it's made me hungry for more Mark Wallace. Definitely to discuss the non-chocolate aspects of your experiences in Africa and the colonial legacies and all that. But before we go, have you listened to any episodes, Mark?
I listened to a couple. Yeah, I've listened to two of them.
So you know what's coming up next. What do you want to say as a public service announcement to the world about either chocolate consumption or just generally choices in life, I suppose?
Yeah, I think that the biggest public service announcement that I want to say is to just pay attention. And I think it's pretty easy to tell if you really think about it, or if you really like think about how you're feeling after you consume something, after you eat something. I think you'll kind of know, but just pay attention to what's going on because it does matter. As consumers out there, as people who are going through this world, it matters where you're choosing to spend your money, or what you're choosing to feed yourself and your children and things like that. And it's not always super transparent, or sometimes it require a bit of work. But I think in the end, it's worth it. When we're going to the supermarket and buying food, we kind of lose track of where that's coming from. We talked a lot about like deforestation, and we talked about people, and we talked about exploitation, and we talked about globalization and things like that. And we totally lose sight of the people part of it. Yeah, just that's what kind of drives me all the time, as I think about the people I've met and like the families I've met. That's why I do it. And when we make good choices as consumers, it really makes a difference to actual humans. It does go a long way. It actually does make a difference.
Yeah. Yeah, that, I mean, fantastic. I'll struggle to follow that. In general, I'd say to those of us who maybe live in smaller villages and stuff, and you only have the village shop and the most exotic chocolate you can find is like Lindt, then maybe just wait till you visit a garden center or a craft fair or something, and then buy a supply. Chocolate is a long shelf life item in most cases, at least lasts for a couple of months, right? So buy lots when you find real stuff, right?
Yeah, you said it. Agreed. And then all these good chocolate makers too, they'll have a website and stuff. You can talk to them directly. They're always responsive. And, this day and age, you can get stuff right to your doorstep.
Yeah, awesome. And the website is
wallacechocolate.com. I don't know if you have to do the W's anymore, but wallacechocolate.com.
Yeah, wallacechocolate.com, and you will ship internationally, and it looks awesome, man. I'm gonna enjoy some. And the rest of you do a little press the buttons. Whatever the internet buttons are, like and subscribe and comment. And also send in some questions and feedback for Mark, because I have decided that you're a gold mine, man. We can talk about so many things, so I will hassle you for another episode later.
Yeah, totally. There's lots that we could talk about. Lots of stuff that I think our interests overlap on for sure. And yeah, if anyone wants to reach out to me, I'm always responsive. Happy to chat about anything. Doesn't have to be about buying chocolate. It can be about pretty much anything at all.
Thank you, and we'll see you next time.
you.